Chapter 1, The Invitation. Jacob Price had never considered himself superstitious, but the letter in his hand made him feel uneasy. It was a formal document from a law firm he had never heard of, delivering news of a distant inheritance, Whitlock Manor, an old Victorian hotel located in the isolated town of Carlington, nestled deep in the Misty Mountains. The name stirred something in Jacob's memory. His mother had spoken once, briefly, of a Whitlock family relation, someone she said had gone mad many years ago. She had never elaborated, and Jacob had been too young to care. Now, curiosity gripped him. His life in the city wasn't going anywhere. He was recently laid off, drowning in bills, and trying to figure out what came next. This unexpected inheritance, even if only worth the land, could be the fresh start he needed. The offer seemed almost too good to be true. Within days, Jacob packed his few belongings and drove out to Carlington. The town was small, almost unnervingly quiet, with only a handful of people scattered across its lone street. They watched him as he passed, their eyes cold and distant, as though recognizing him from some long-forgotten tale. At last, Whitlock Manor came into view, looming over the hills like a dark sentinel. Fog clung to the landscape, swirling around the edges of the towering building. The once grand hotel was now a crumbling relic of a forgotten age, with ivy crawling over its walls and cracked windows staring out like hollow eyes. The sign, hanging askew, read Whitlock Manor, established 1886 in fading gold lettering. A chill ran down Jacob's spine as he pulled into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching beneath him. The air here felt different, heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was watching him. Chapter 2, The First Night. The front doors of Whitlock Manor creaked open as Jacob pushed them, the hinges protesting as though they hadn't been moved in years. Inside, the foyer was massive, with an ornate staircase spiraling up toward the shadowed second floor. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their colors dulled by decades of neglect. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. The reception desk was still intact, complete with an old ledger and a brass bell that hadn't been rung in years. Jacob hesitated before tapping it lightly. The sharp sound echoed through the empty hotel, unnerving him. "Anyone here?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the thick air. Of course, no one responded. He wandered the first floor, the wood beneath his feet creaking with every step. The manor seemed larger inside than it had appeared from the outside. Doors lined the hallways, their brass handles tarnished with age. Some of the rooms were locked, others stood ajar, revealing furniture covered in white sheets and old, dust-covered chandeliers hanging like ghosts. Jacob finally settled into a room on the third floor, room 306. It was one of the few that seemed relatively intact. The four-poster bed still had its curtains, though moth-eaten and yellowed. A grand mirror stood in the corner, its surface slightly fogged as though it too had forgotten its purpose. Night fell quickly, the once muted light outside turning into pitch-black darkness. Jacob lay down, exhaustion finally overtaking him after the long drive. But sleep was fleeting. At first, he heard only the wind outside, a low howl that seemed to wrap around the manor like an embrace. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the corridor outside his room. Jacob sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to his door. Then they stopped. He held his breath, waiting. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Silence returned, but it wasn't the comforting kind. It was a suffocating quiet, the kind that presses down on your chest and squeezes the air from your lungs. Jacob lay back down, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But when he glanced at the mirror, he froze. In the fogged surface of the mirror were letters, as if someone had traced them with a finger. Get out. Chapter 3, The Guests That Never Left. The next morning, the message was gone. The mirror reflected only Jacob's pale, haggard face. He tried to brush off the experience as a vivid dream, the product of fatigue and an overactive imagination. Yet, the unease lingered. As he explored more of Whitlock Manor, the strangeness only deepened. The architecture of the building made no sense. Corridors seemed to twist in impossible directions, some ending abruptly in blank walls while others looped back on themselves. At times, Jacob found himself at doors he was sure he hadn't passed before. It was as though the hotel was playing tricks on him, shifting and changing behind his back. In the dining hall, he discovered a collection of old photographs. They were mounted on the walls, each one framed in ornate gold, chronicling the long history of the hotel. The earliest photos were black and white, depicting the grand opening in 1886. There were dozens of smiling faces, well-dressed men and women, their eyes gleaming with hope for a luxurious stay. But as Jacob examined the photos more closely, his unease grew. In every picture, there was something wrong. The smiles were too wide, the eyes too vacant. One particular photo caught his attention, a group of guests sitting around a large table in the grand dining hall. Their faces were frozen in unnerving grins, and at the head of the table sat a man with a gaunt, stern face, John Whitlock, the original owner of the hotel. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. The faces in the photograph seemed to follow him as he moved. And then, he noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the background of the photo, standing near the entrance, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure that was almost transparent, barely noticeable at first glance. But once Jacob saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The figure had no face, just a dark void where its features should have been. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the hotel itself was watching him. Chapter 4, The Lost Stories. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They came from outside his door, the soft murmurs of voices he didn't recognize. "Jacob," they called. "Jacob, why did you come?" His heart pounded as he got out of bed, grabbing a flashlight. He hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The corridor was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight seeping through the cracks in the windows. But the whispers continued, echoing from somewhere deep within the hotel. He followed the sound, his pulse quickening with every step. The whispers led him down twisting hallways and winding staircases, deeper into the heart of Whitlock Manor. The further he went, the more the hotel seemed to change. The walls became narrower, the air colder. Paintings on the walls stared down at him with hollow eyes, and the wooden floor beneath him groaned as though it was alive. Finally, he reached a door. It was an old wooden door, splintered and cracked with age. The whispers were louder now, coming from behind it. With trembling hands, Jacob opened the door. Inside was a room he hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the others, with only a single bed and a wardrobe. But what caught his attention was the desk in the corner. On it was an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Jacob approached cautiously, flipping it open. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, entries from John Whitlock himself. As he read, the horrifying truth began to unravel. John Whitlock had been obsessed with the occult. In his later years, he had turned the hotel into a site for secret gatherings, inviting only the wealthiest and most powerful guests. But these gatherings weren't for business or pleasure, they were rituals. Dark rituals designed to summon spirits and bind them to the hotel. Whitlock's obsession grew darker with time. The final entry described a ritual gone wrong. The spirits he had tried to summon had turned on him, trapping not only themselves but the souls of the hotel's guests within its walls. "Their fate is sealed," the entry read. "They can never leave." Jacob's hands trembled as he closed the journal. The whispers were all around him now, louder, angrier. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice whispered in his ear. He spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to deepen, crawling up the walls like living things. The room was closing in on him, suffocating him. He had to get out, now. Chapter 5, Trapped. Over the next few days, Jacob's grip on reality began to fray. The hotel seemed alive, its walls shifting and changing with every step he took. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find the front door. Every corridor looped back on itself, leading him deeper into the labyrinth. The guests, the spirits trapped within the hotel, became more aggressive. They appeared more frequently now, their translucent forms wandering the halls, their faces gaunt and hollow. They repeated moments from their past lives, locked in a cycle of misery and fear. At first, they ignored Jacob, as though he were just another shadow among them. But soon, they began to notice him. Their eyes followed him as he moved, their mouths forming silent words. And then, one night, they began to speak. "You belong to the hotel now," they whispered. "You cannot leave. You are one of us." Jacob tried to fight back, to break the cycle. He smashed mirrors, tore down paintings, even set fire to some of the rooms. But nothing worked. The hotel always repaired itself, the damage vanishing as soon as it was done. Every time he tried to escape, he found himself back in room 306, as though the hotel had decided it was where he belonged. Jacob's desperation grew. He stopped sleeping, too afraid of the nightmares that plagued him whenever he closed his eyes. The whispers never ceased, always there, just at the edge of his hearing, taunting him. The hotel wanted something from him, but he didn't know what. Not yet. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. In a final attempt to find answers, Jacob searched the basement of Whitlock Manor. The air down there was even colder, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. He stumbled through the dark, his flashlight flickering as though the very building was draining its power. After hours of searching, he found it, the hidden chamber where John Whitlock had performed his final ritual. The symbols were still etched into the stone floor, glowing faintly in the dim light. And in the center of the room stood a large, cracked mirror. As Jacob approached, he saw not his own reflection, but the faces of the trapped souls. They stared at him, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. John Whitlock. "You've come to take my place," Whitlock said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The hotel needs a new master." Jacob tried to run, but the room spun around him, the shadows swallowing him whole. The spirits swarmed him, their voices growing louder, more frantic. "You are part of us now, Jacob. You will never leave." He fell to the floor, the darkness closing in. The last thing he saw was Whitlock's twisted smile as the hotel consumed him. Epilogue. Weeks later, a local detective arrived at Whitlock Manor, responding to reports of strange noises and missing persons. He searched the hotel but found no trace of Jacob Price. But on the reception desk, he found an old photograph. In it, Jacob stood among the guests of Whitlock Manor, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The hotel had claimed another soul. And Whitlock Manor waited, patient and eternal, for its next visitor.